I realized that what Howard wanted to do was to get out of partisanship. So Howard always ran on a platform that he was not a spoiler, he was insurance. He was insurance in
Okay.
case Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren got the Democratic nomination because he did not believe that they would be able to beat Trump. And so he was running it as an independent to create a candidacy in which moderate Democrats and Republicans can get around. If Joe
All right.
Biden was a candidate, there would be no need for Howard Schultz. And by all measures, in my view, Joe Biden is running the campaign that Howard would have run.
Hi there. Welcome to another episode of Chinatown 2.0. We're an interview podcast where we explore the stories, ideas, and actions of global citizens with Chinese heritage. I'm your host, Richard Yan. Today, we're interviewing Lin Yang, a grassroots political organizer who also works in tech. Lin had a full-time job working for Howard Schultz, helping him explore a presidential run. For those unaware, Howard Schultz was the founder and previous CEO for Starbucks. Lin also participated in campaigns for President Obama and Senator Ted Lieu from California. He also worked as a journalist in Asia for a while, writing articles for various newspapers like New York Times when he was stationed in Taiwan, and the Strait Times when he was in Singapore. Lin is also the founder of a local newspaper for the town of Sammamish, Washington, where he currently lives. He started the paper after seeing that a lack of objective information led to a local election where the citizens were either uninformed or misinformed. Lin is also a Biden supporter. Today, we discuss experience campaigning for elections, working as a journalist in Asia, how he started a local paper, why he wanted to vote Biden, and views on the contentious California proposition, Prop 16, that want to reintroduce racial preference in public employment and public education. As usual, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell on our YouTube channel. Thank you. Hey Lin, welcome to Chinatown 2.0. How's it going?
Great, Richard. Thanks for having me on. I've been listening to a few of your episodes. They're great conversations, and I'm very excited to be a part of it.
Great. Well, you're one of the rare guests we've had so far that have had grassroots political campaigning experience. And I find that part of you very fascinating. And obviously, you've done other things too, such as reporting overseas and so forth. Why don't you walk us through your experience in political campaigning and also maybe touch upon your unique experience of working overseas for New York Times and some other media outlets out there?
Yeah, I think you overstated my qualifications in a sense that I would describe myself as a campaign for fun kind of guy, right? And so
Okay.
most of the campaigning that I've done have always been as an extracurricular outside of work activity, whereby I have a full-time job that actually makes my living, and I do the doorbelling and campaigning and advocacy on nights and weekends, if you will, right?
That's already more than a lot of us, especially
Right.
Asians, I feel, to be honest.
Yeah, and so I would have to say it started, well, in high school and college, I always did things like register voters. That's usually where people start. They set up a booth, let people fill out a voter registration form. So that's usually where it starts, right? And I would have to say it didn't really come to the fore of me actually campaigning and knocking on doors until 2008 for the Obama campaign. And then I was in graduate school. I was studying public policy at Harvard. And when you're going to public policy school at Harvard, almost all of your classmates are ending up working in the federal government. Half of our professors were advising one campaign or the other. And so a lot of my classmates wanted to, participate. And while during the
So something
primary,
I've
yep,
always been wondering about
yeah,
Harvard, what's the percentage of your classmates would you say that lean left versus right?
I would say it would probably be around 65-35 for a public policy school like Harvard.
Okay.
I think the reason,
65 left, 35 right.
yes, right,
Yeah.
65 Democratic, 35% Republican, but my class was also probably 40 to 50% international, right? So you can't
Okay.
really put them into the equation. It's pretty hard to apply the left and right frame that we
Okay.
have in America.
But by the way, you don't consider
Yep.
yourself international, right? Just to make sure.
No, I'm
Right.
a U.S. citizen. Yeah,
Right,
so
right, right. That's
totally,
what
I
I
was
thought.
totally a domestic focused student.
Okay.
But the reason, and let me explain, the reason is because it actually has a lot to do with who's in power. Because at the Kennedy School, what ends up happening is the party that's in power, who has the White House, the
Yeah.
other party, the losing party, has all the professors at the school, right? They come as visiting scholars, lecturers, because they don't have a job in DC, right? And
Oh,
so
wow. That is a very
yeah, and
interesting
so and
observation.
so
Yeah.
there are times when there's actually a quite robust conservative student body because they want to learn from these luminaries, right? When I was
Mm,
there, it was George W. Bush's presidency, so all the professors were kind of on the liberal side, right? And they
okay.
were advising the Obama campaign. But anyways, back to the original story.
Right.
I went to doorbell in North Carolina for the Obama campaign when he was in deep throes of primary battle with Hillary Clinton.
Right.
My father at the time lived in North Carolina, so a bunch of us flew down there. We slept on his couch down in North Carolina, and we doorbell by day, and we stayed all the way through the primary. And Obama ended up winning that state.
Yeah.
So,
Right
I,
on.
yeah, and so
He
after
has
we
you to thank.
doorbell,
Your dad's couch.
well, my dad's couch, and that victory really got me hooked, right?
Were people generally friendly towards doorbelling?
The reason doorbelling is important, especially in primaries, is the turnout in primaries are usually really low, right? 30%, 40%. That's a pretty good turnout for the primary. So
Right.
oftentimes most people don't know that there's a primary election going on. And so they're usually pretty friendly. Oftentimes, because it's North Carolina is a battleground, but they were so late in the calendar, they usually don't have people knocking on their doors that late in the season, right? And so,
Yeah.
they a lot of people wanted to talk. I remember once I was speaking to a conservative and I was trying to convince him to vote for Obama. And I was like debating policy with him in his backyard for like an hour. And I finally convinced him and I gave him the little pamphlet and told him where to go and everything. And so it's like stuff like that is so much fun and it's super rewarding afterwards. And
And I mean, it feels almost like evangelism, right? You're very passionate about this cause, and then you're getting people the good news, and then you're converting them into this belief. I mean, obviously, that's very satisfying.
it is kind of like evangelism, right? Oftentimes, users are trying to educate people about the candidates because oftentimes it is about policy, but it's also about what the candidates stands for from a philosophical standpoint, right?
Yeah.
I guess in that way, it is kind of like evangelism because religion is also a philosophy that you're trying to explain as well. But we're
Yeah.
never really pushy about it. The first question is, do you know there's primary going on and do you have a plan, right? And
Right.
then if they want to find out more about the candidate, then we tell them. But the key thing is to get them to vote. And even if it was a Republican, I would still rather them vote than completely ignore them, right? I would still remind them that a primary is going on.
Even if you were to get people to vote, there's no guarantee that they will be sufficiently educated to make the right choice. I feel that it's always been sort of the prerogative of the left to try to get more people to vote because, in general, the more voting happens, the more likely the more Democratic leaning candidate will win, right? I actually don't know about many Republicans out there trying to get people to vote in swing states. If anything, I think they would try to discourage people to vote. Would you say that's the
Every
case?
I wouldn't say that's entirely accurate. Every party is interested in discouraging the other side to vote and encouraging their own side to vote, right? In
True.
fact, this election has been very strange because of COVID. It's actually the Republican Party out there knocking on doors and asking people to vote to try to get turnout because the Democratic Party is trying to maintain a mirage of social distancing and to let people know that they're taking the coronavirus seriously. So there's not really a lot of actually doorbelling on the Democratic side. Most of the get out the vote
Wait, hold
effort.
on a second. So you're saying the Democrats are not doorbelling because they want to maintain this idea that they're serious about people's health?
Exactly. In fact,
Okay.
it was pretty well reported in the media. The Republican Party had thousands of volunteers knocking on the doors, and the Democratic Party went publicly and said, "We're not going to do it because, we don't want to be
Hmm.
vectors of COVID transmission."
Interesting. I wonder if there are other democratic election oriented countries with more advanced balloting systems for elections as important as the national election out there outside of the US.
Oh yeah, what would you define as more advanced? Are you talking about electronic balloting or just great systems for voting?
Yeah, so I think a couple of different things, right? Number one is just more convenient way of voting. I
Yeah.
mean, these days you're taking a Scantron, you're filling out these little bubbles, and then you have to follow these instructions. You have to remove the top of the pages and slide them into some envelope and drop them off somewhere. I think this is highly discouraging to lazy millennials, to the younger generation.
Yeah.
And I think the other part of being advanced is just better marketing in terms of generating better voter turnout. I mean, I understand there's the whole electoral college effect and so forth, but I wonder if all these media outlets can do a better job of telling people about this opportunity to participate in politics that's going on.
I honestly don't think it's a issue that people don't know that there's a presidential election going on. This election coming up is so, I guess, consequential, right, in terms of
Yeah,
who the two candidates are, how differently they are, and the issues that they stand for, but mostly because of how terrible economic and public health situation our country is currently in. And so it's usually during these disastrous times that people start parking up, right, and realize if I want to change something, I better go and voice my vote now. When things are
yeah,
good, people don't really care, right, as much.
right.
As far as kind of voting systems, I actually would tend to agree with you from a perspective that I think voting in the United States is too complicated. And I don't mean it from a perforated ballot, too many bubbles perspective. I mean it from a there are too many different ways to vote in the US. The voting periods are in some states, 3 weeks, in some states 6 weeks, in some states you can only vote on the day of and you have to show up in person, right?
Right.
And so because of this disparity, if say I moved from Texas to California, like I would have to learn a completely new voting system and a new set of rules.
Right.
The problem I think in the US is that our national system is not unified, right, from the federal level in terms of there's no a federal list of guidelines of what kind of voting system you have to have. Like you can let the states handle it, but you have to have a set of general rules, right? Other than
Right.
the fact that there's election day on one day, maybe rules on like what are the rules for mail balloting? What are the rules for the machines? How many items can you have on each ballot? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there's no standard for that. And I think the other reason that the US has so many different ways of voting is because on election day, there are not enough polling places to make voting efficient, right?
Right. So
Uh,
people stand
in
in
line
long
for
lines, and then,
exactly.
some people just avoid doing so.
Yeah,
Right. I mean, you have to skip. And the other thing is that it's also not on the weekend. So people have to skip out work to do this. They might not
exactly.
get compensated for this.
Exactly. Right. And so we by that reason have this stupid system where it's on a Tuesday, but then we extend it out for 3 weeks to give people weekends. It doesn't make any sense. And the
Yeah.
comparison I would have is like I covered elections in Taiwan, and we can talk about this later, but I was a journalist in Taiwan.
Right on.
And watching how the Taiwanese handle elections is incredible. The Taiwanese are renowned for tremendous operations. That's why they build iPhones in China, because they know how to get things working very, very well, almost mechanical, right?
Yeah.
And their voting is absolutely mechanical and flawless. There's so many precincts that nobody needs to wait in line probably for more than 30 minutes to cast a ballot. Every ballot is cast and they count every single ballot by hand and then with camera proof in every precinct. So there's a camera that shows what's on the ballot and a person tallying and a person shouting to that person what's on the ballot, right? So there's evidence there's analog evidence, if you can imagine, right, of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
count. And then there's no mail balloting because their vote happens on a Saturday and nobody has to wait in line. And so everybody knows exactly what the result is. When I was covering the 2012 elections, we knew who won 20 minutes after polls closed,
Amazing.
right?
Yeah.
It's
Right on.
amazing,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And it was so efficient. And in a system like that, nobody complains that they can't vote by mail, right? Because the physical voting is so easy and people trust it. And then the other thing is, we in the US have such a complicated system for nominating and then electing. So there's primaries, there's general elections, there's so many elections. It was funny because, again, drawing from a piece of my experience, I remember when I was working for Howard Schultz, who was
Yeah.
thinking about running for president, there was a story that said Schultz didn't vote in like half of the elections that happened in Washington state over the last year. And then when you look at the deeper into the story, it said in the last 2 years, Washington state had 8 elections and Schultz only voted in 4 of them. The first question that came to my mind is, why do we have 8 elections in the span of 2 years? Just why? Right? Like, so I'm a huge advocate of trying to make voting much easier for everyone.
Okay. So maybe tell us a little bit more about how you got into the campaign for Howard Schultz.
Yeah, it's a very good story. So I've been a lifelong Democrat, and I was doing a lot of political organizing work when I lived in the Bay Area. I was working in the tech sector and doing this on the side. I ran the Peninsula Young Democrats, and I was very interested in politics and potentially exploring a job in politics. I had a friend who told me that she was working for Howard Schultz, and my friend asked me if I would be interested in joining the campaign. At first, I was skeptical, right? Because the press was basically slamming his race and saying that he would be a spoiler for the Democratic Party by being a third party candidate. But I think what won me over was watching him speak. And I realized that what Howard wanted to do was to get out of partisanship. This is 2 years after the Trump administration came to power. We just had a really contentious House of Representatives race. This is a country that was very divided. And it seems like every issue, there was a Republican side and there was a Democratic side, and there was no daylight in the middle.
Yeah.
And it was almost like you had to pick one side or the other because each side was going mono y mono and taking more and more hardened and extreme positions against reacting to the other side.
Right.
And what
It's really
Howard,
weird
yeah,
how your view of climate change can predict your view on gun control, for example, even though there might not
oh,
be good correlation between your reasoning on these two issues. But that's how partisan people can get, right? And then
yeah,
they reason their way into, well, I think this makes sense.
yeah. But Howard had a great story, right? He grew up poor in the projects in New York and in
So
Brooklyn.
rags to riches.
Yeah. And his parents were super working class. He didn't go to a very good college whatsoever. He was a salesman, right? I think he sold washing machines or something like that. But then the story was he went to Seattle and he found this company that was selling coffee and these espresso machines. And he fell in love with espresso and convinced the owner of the company to hire him. And then he wanted to create this, what Starbucks is today, this cafe, but the owners were interested. And so he left, started his own thing, and then came back and bought the company from the people that hired him before, and then
Right.
expanded it. His idea caught fire, right? And Starbucks is everywhere in the world now. Um, and it was a true rags to riches story because Howard never forgot where he came from, right? And so he wanted to always run a company that was led by compassion, right? And opportunity. And so he was one of the trailblazers who did things like give all of his employees, part-time employees, health insurance, right? He started a program where all of his employees were able to work for a college degree over 4 years for free if they kept on working for Starbucks during those 4 years. So it was a
Yeah.
part-time online program. And
Right.
so he was that mix between, I guess Republicans would call that socialism, but it really isn't, right? It's work hard and the society and the company will help you, get to wherever you want to go next, right? And
Right.
so I think it's that perfect mix of public interest and capitalism. And he wanted to bring that into DC, right?
Okay.
And find all these positions that sit in the daylight between what the Democratic side wants and the Republican side wants. And I just remember, and since we're talking about Howard, and was instrumental in building the policy platform to help Howard prepare for his town halls. And it was incredible because the team that advised Howard was a team of Republicans and Democrats. And every single issue, we were able to strike a middle that everyone on the team was actually happy with because it represented progress from where we are now, right? And so Howard's proposal for immigration reform was, let's increase security on the border so that no people who don't have status or are illegal can get in. But for the people who are in the country, we can't kick them out. It's just too expensive to kick them out. It's not practical, right? And so let's figure out a path to citizenship for them that includes a fine, maybe a few steps and applications and fees and extended time for a green card, right, before they can get a citizen. But it was like super sensible. Climate change. His idea was, let's not ban anything. Let's do a carbon tax.
He kind of reminds me of a younger Bloomberg, to be
Yeah.
honest. But so what happened to his campaign? I wasn't able to follow what happened afterwards. Yeah.
So Howard always ran on a platform that he was not a spoiler. He was insurance. He was insurance in
Okay.
case Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren got the Democratic nomination because he did not believe that they would be able to beat Trump. And so he was running it as an independent to create a candidacy in which moderate Democrats and Republicans can get around, right?
Okay.
Now, it's open question whether that could work or not. We would never know. So what ended up happening was the anecdote that I heard was that he was making a pot of coffee for his staff on the campaign bus. The bus took a wide turn. He took a spill and fell onto the ground and he broke his back. And he ended up having to get 3 back surgeries. And then by the end of June, he decided to pull out and the campaign ended.
Right. It's ironic coffee played a role in the end of this campaign run.
That might have been embellished. I'm not sure, right? This is just a rumor that I heard from
Got it.
somebody, but it would be such a Howard story if it were actually true and it was him pouring coffee
Right,
and
right, right,
not
right,
sitting
right.
in a seatbelt.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to be honest, he really sounded like he could have been a very formidable candidate. What's his
Yeah.
view on universal healthcare, by the way?
He believed that insurance should be what it is, which is insurance. And
Okay.
so he believed in having a what we would call a catastrophic healthcare policy that applied to everyone, in which any healthcare bill over $10,000 would be covered by the government. But you'd be on the hook to cover whatever is below that, whether it's with additional insurance or saving money in a health savings account or something like that. But he
Right.
believed that insurance should serve as insurance, which is to insure against bankruptcy.
I see.
Yeah.
So a public plan with a big deductible, like a
Yeah,
$10,000,
exactly.
something like
Exactly.
that.
And it would only apply to people who didn't have, say, like their own private insurance, like you and I do through our employer. Like
Got
we
it,
would
got it.
have much more generous plans because our employer has that as a benefit to get us to work for them, right?
Right, right.
But for those who can't afford anything, he did not believe that anyone should be bankrupt because of healthcare costs, and that's the public option that he would provide.
Yeah, sounds like a very sensible candidate. It's a shame that him and people like Michael Bloomberg can't make it. But let's get back to politics a little bit later. I'd love to hear more about 2 other things. One is your experience working overseas. Why'd you get into that? And
Yep.
your stories about working in those places as a journalist. And then the second thing is your experience running a podcast and a local newspaper in your town, which is quite fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. The 2 stories are related. My journalism experience is leading to what I'm doing now, which is starting a local newspaper in my hometown. So going back to kind of my career directory, so I ended up having an opportunity through a friend at the Kennedy School to take an internship at the Straits Times, which is a newspaper in Singapore. She was a reporter at the Straits Times who was also studying at the Kennedy School. And so this was me. I was 27 years old, traveling to Singapore to do an internship. And it was super exciting. And it was a local newspaper. The Straits Times mostly covered Singapore news. And it was a great place to cut my teeth because what they would do is they would assign me to write a story for their Sunday newspaper. And every story was like a wild goose chase. And the Sunday paper
What do
is
you mean by
usually,
that?
yeah, let me explain. So the
Yeah.
Sunday paper is usually this like fun magazine-like paper, right? So every
Okay.
Sunday I would have to write this really long, interesting kind of,
Kind of like New Yorker.
peculiar story,
Yeah.
kind of like New Yorker, I guess.
Yeah.
But they would always send me on these wild topics. So for instance, one of the topics I had to write about was different neighborhood smells in Singapore and what causes them, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So there was like a chicken factory, a chocolate factory, like that has all these wafting smells in the neighborhood. I would like walk the streets and ask the neighbors, hey, what's causing that smell in your neighborhood? Right? Right. So these crazy stories, but it really made me scrappy. Like I would be able to hit my deadline every single week, figuring out and doing these like mini investigative journalism pieces, essentially. But the Singapore was never a really free press market, right? Because it's quite controlled. You can never cover really consequential topics like policy in a critical way. And so I ended up moving to Taiwan, which is basically the most freewheeling media environment in all of the Chinese speaking world.
By the way, back to Singapore quickly. Is there censorship?
Yes, there is
Okay.
unspoken censorship because
Okay.
the government does have a stake in the media company, and It's very much self-censorship in a sense that I have gotten a story canned because it was too sensitive by my editors. The government didn't do anything. It was my editors who know that they don't
Okay.
want to get in trouble.
Right. So in a sense, the major media outlets are state-owned, but you can still do Twitter and Facebook, and
Yeah.
then you can openly criticize the government. It's just that it won't go too far, at least not covered by the legacy media outlets.
Well, there are people who have openly criticized by the government and then sued to bankruptcy by the government as well, because libel and slander laws are very favorable to the government in Singapore. I mean, technically, you can say anything on the street, right? Nobody's going to care about you. But the minute you publish something, whether it's in a blog or newspaper form, and if the government can find a flaw somehow in what you wrote, they can make sure you don't have any money left.
All right, good to know.
Yeah.
All right, on to Taiwan.
So I moved to Taiwan. I started out as a copy editor in Taiwan, and the cool thing about these like tiny country news beats is that you know everyone who's covering that country from different media outlets. Like I knew who worked there from the Wall Street Journal. I knew who worked there from Reuters. I knew all the stringer for the New York Times and the Economist. And usually when one of them decides to go on and move to a different country, and you're looking for more strings, they in this little journalism network, they come to you and they're like, hey, do you want to, be the next New York Times stringer for Taiwan? And I'm like, sure, right? And
Wait, hold on, I didn't get it. What do you mean stringer?
Stringer would be a freelancer who writes and covers a country and gets paid by article.
Okay.
Right. So I'm not a fully a paid staff member, but I contribute to the New York Times through stories. And so if they need me or if I have a good story idea, they contact me or I contact them. And then if they commission an article and I produce it, I get paid for that article.
Okay. So you're kind of not W-2 and you're sort of 1099, but you're getting paid by article, right?
Yeah, that's the US frame of saying it.
Right, right.
My favorite string was definitely the New York Times when I was down there, because Taiwan was a very, very, at that time, and even today, a hot market for tech and Apple news. And so I wrote 2 stories about Apple when I was out there through the lens of Foxconn, which is their supplier. And every single story I wrote about Foxconn and Apple, I would make it to the front page above the fold every single time.
Since you're a journalist, I have to ask this, right? So what do you think of the state of journalism in America these days? It's sort of under attack from the left and the right. My understanding is just that people don't trust the media as much as they used to.
In terms of media trust, I think it is a factor of the media trying to find the kind of content that can survive in this market.
Survive the competition.
Yeah, but also what people are interested in reading these days because of social media. Now, most of the stories and the headlines that are created, there's no nuance, right?
Yeah.
They're very clickbaity.
Clickbaits.
They're very, very kind of suggestive, outrageous headlines. A lot of the articles are, I mean, you can really tell that there's a specific angle and sometimes partisan lean that they're trying to push. And it's quite hard to find, kind of objective news that has enough room in which you take the information in, but you make a decision of what's happening for yourself. I think some papers still do that. I think the New York Times international coverage is still relatively objective. The Wall Street Journal is relatively objective. I read The Economist a lot because, if I tend to get too left-leaning and when I read the Times or read CNN, The Economist always brings me back to earth, right? By sometimes, saying the positive things that Trump has done, for instance, right? And so as far as local news, moving on to your second question. So I started a local newspaper. It happened after COVID happened. And what really prompted me to start the local newspaper was we actually, in my hometown, Sammamish, Washington, went through an election last year where there was no newspaper. It was the first election where there was no town newspaper actually telling people what the issues are.
Right.
There used to be a free paper that people got like once or twice a month.
Okay.
And it went out of business in 2018. And so that election was rough. There was a lot of misinformation on social media. And what I gather is the side that won was the side that organized a Facebook group that seemed to promote voting, but it was used by one side in the election to peddle a viewpoint and a platform, and everyone else who disagreed with them were secretly kicked out of the group.
Wait,
And
hold on.
yeah,
So sorry. So, but this election, though, did you feel that the two sides or the multiple sides that competed were of such different opinions that voting in one versus another would have made a big difference?
yeah, it was. So as a suburb, our like the development, and housing are big issues here.
Right.
And there's one side that wants to build more housing, and there's the other side that wants to preserve the nature and the trees and make sure our roads are not overcrowded, right?
Okay. Who's in charge
Common
now?
issues.
The first kind?
The second side,
Second side. Okay.
what we call the NIMBY side. I'm sure that's a
NIMBY.
term that you guys
Yeah.
are very familiar with in the Bay
Yes.
Area.
Painfully.
People who
Yeah.
don't
Wow.
exactly, right. So the NIMBY side are fully in charge of the city I live in right now.
Right.
But they were very smart in their political strategy. Without a newspaper, arbiter of information, they basically controlled the information flow. They put up these signs all over town that says, if you want to find out more about the election, go join this Facebook group.
Yeah.
That Facebook group was controlled by one side.
Okay.
They were very effective in peddling oftentimes misinformation about the other candidates and driving voter turnout. And this is the little secret about voting is we have off-year elections, so our elections don't happen in the federal election years. And so turnout is usually low anyways. And so it's usually the side who has their shit together, who can get as many people out as possible, will easily win. And they did that effectively, right?
Yep.
So after that experience and I saw what happened in a community with losing a newspaper, I have this idea of starting one based on my journalism experience. And then COVID hit. And what I realized was that now they were all locking down at home, nobody knows and is seeing anyone in the community or talking to people face to face. And so information is now so much more important, right? And so I decided to start a newspaper called the Sammamish Independent. And I knew that newspapers cannot be profitable locally because it is such a tough market to try to get advertising and be sustainable. And so I turned it into a nonprofit model. And my writers are all high school students. And
Okay.
so these are high school students who are now all going to school from home. They have no sports, no extracurriculars. And so when I set up the program and started asking for applications, say, we'll train you to become a journalist and you can write for our newspaper for the town, the demand was huge. Like I had to turn
I can
kids away.
imagine. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I had to turn kids away. And so we ran 4 weeks of workshops to train them on everything from how to source to how to interview to how to write an article, how to frame a story, all that stuff, right? And then we got them going and 2 kids to a beat. We have city hall beat, business beat, sports, education, community. A few kids wanted to start a podcast, so we now have a podcast. And then what I also do is once a month, I invite a real world journalist to do a workshop with them and to do a Q&A. And
Very
so
nice.
last
Wow.
week we had a Washington Post journalist who's a China correspondent, a good friend of mine who I met in Taiwan, speak to the kids about what it's like being American journalists in China, what it was like getting followed by plainclothes policemen and feeling like her phone is being tapped and all that stuff. These are wild stories that kids from a small town are like, whoa, right?
So you guys are called independent. How do you stay unbiased?
Yeah, the way that we stay unbiased is we make sure that what we report is based on facts, right? And so I once did a story about, and this is small town issues, but because of COVID, neighboring towns have started a farmers market, but our town has not. There was a attempt at our Chamber of Commerce to start a farmers market, but the mayor of the town discouraged the host, which was a local high school, from hosting it. I didn't want to run the story because I thought it was just a rumor until somebody sent me a city records request with an email in which the mayor specifically emailed the head of the school telling him not to do it. And so I report based on facts. If I have a fact that says mayor discourages farmers market because I have an email signed by the mayor that discourages farmers market, I'm going to run that story because that's what happened.
Okay.
And so that's what we do is we make sure that everything is rooted in fact. Our opinion page is for people who have opinions, but we train our journalists to talk to people, get quotes, get data, get evidence before writing an angle. And that's what we stick by.
I almost feel like you should turn this into a local newspaper as a service model. So basically, like I live in the town of Sunnyvale, and we don't really have a well-functioning newspaper system, I feel, getting this
It's
started.
funny you should mention it because I actually sent all of my materials to a city councilor in Sunnyvale who emailed me and told me she was interested in replicating my program.
Oh, okay.
I would have to say the flaw in my model is because we're all run by volunteers. Breaking news and burglaries are not our forte, right? Because it requires a full-time person, immediately dialing the police within 24 hours and pumping out a story quickly. We tend to do like follow-up stories to that, things that take a week to do, right? Feel-good stories, more longer-term features, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think you would need a fully paid staff member if you want to do breaking news very well.
I'd love to get your take on the current election, a very important one. And I have a feeling you're going to vote for Joe Biden if you haven't already done so.
I
Maybe.
have.
Okay, perfect. So maybe tell us a little bit about some of the more non-obvious and non-mainstream reasons why you think he is a better candidate. And maybe also talk about how you would empathize with the appeal of Trump on the other side.
Yeah. If to talk about Joe Biden, I'm going to go back to Howard, and why I worked for Howard is because of that bipartisanship, right?
Right.
Howard was going to be in it unless, in fact, the internal mantra was always unless Joe Biden becomes the candidate.
So do
Because
you
if
think he
Joe
would have
Biden,
withdrawn then, given
yes,
the outcome? He would
yeah,
have?
he would have. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
If Joe
All right.
Biden was the candidate, Howard Schultz, there would be no need for Howard Schultz. And by all measures, in my view, Joe Biden is running the campaign that Howard would have run, right? So the reason I support him is because Biden is led by compassion and led by a feeling that we are greater as a nation if we work together rather than fighting each other and splitting apart. And I think the core of that compassion and knowing Biden and what his story is the tragedy that he had in the 70s when a car accident killed his wife and his daughter. And his calling to public service and to serve others is very much rooted in that moment of personal loss. And so look at where our country is now, right? We have two parties that refuses to work with each other. We have a pandemic that's killed over 200,000 people and even more. We have millions of people who don't have a job. And we have a racial tension caused by both police brutality and just inherent institutional racism that still exists hundreds of years after the end of slavery and decades after the civil rights movement. And this is the time when we need a leader who will listen and actually show compassion to all the people who are suffering and to find solutions from that suffering, right? That will help as many people as possible. I believe that Biden is that person because of who he is and where he comes from, right? And he demonstrates that with every single person that he meets by when visiting Wisconsin, visiting the family of
Jacob Blake.
Jacob Blake, and not rushing to conclusion whether it's Bullies or Blake or so forth, but trying to find a middle ground where we can move forward both with police reform and also education and training about racism, right? And how apparent it is in this country. And this goes back to my platform that I created, I was building for Howard. There are all these issues where a middle ground represents progress from where we are now, right?
Okay, and you're saying Joe Biden is using that playbook.
I think in a lot of policies he is somewhat literally using that playbook, right? Like for instance, I think the climate change debate has shifted a little bit. Now it's not just about a climate tax, but now the climate change debate is put, at least Biden's policy is put in the framework of economic recovery. And how can we recover better than before? If we're already spending trillions of dollars in stimulus, why not spend it in the kind of infrastructure that will set up our country up for success in the future? And renewable infrastructure is the key there, because we all know fossil fuels are not going to be in 20 years as the primary energy source for most of the world because of its impact on climate change and the fact that renewables are going to be cheaper. And so let's lead on that, right? And so, but he's not going completely nuts, like Green New Deal nuts, where everyone gets a free job and education is free for everyone, which is completely widely out of scope from a climate change perspective, right? And so
Right.
healthcare as well, like if you love your insurance, keep it, right? But what we want to do is provide a public option for people who have really terrible insurance plans right now so that they can buy into Medicare, right? That's a very middle of the road, almost like Howard Schultz disaster policy kind of a, buy-in plan. And so Biden represents that middle road, that sensible approach. And that's why you have all these moderate Republicans, including all of my colleagues from the Howard Schultz campaign who are now running the Lincoln Project, all these attack ads against Trump. That's
Yeah.
them, right? Because
Okay.
they were invested in defeating Trump through Howard, and now they're invested in defeating Trump through Biden. And so I think he represents the best hope to get us out of the divisiveness in politics that we're in right now. I would say that divisiveness always existed. It started in the Clinton era. It just got worse through the Bush era, through 2 wars. It got turbocharged during the Obama era because of many reasons, including Obama being the first African American president, but also Obama's inexperience and work on both sides of the aisle, for instance, to find compromise. And then it got put on steroids during Trump, because what Trump does is he feeds off of both attention and division. The more chaos Trump can create, the better Trump looks as the only solution to resolve the chaos, right? And so we're at a point that's the lowest of the low in terms of division. And I think we need someone like Joe Biden to get us back on track.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why there's so much unrest is this person that's in charge in the White House. I think having him removed from the office would be part of the solution. I think a
Yeah.
lot of this racial acrimony and this maybe bad feeling about institutional racism might have been amplified as a result of people being willing to vote for somebody like that.
Yeah, and it's more like, Trump is the kind of person who would pour gasoline on the fire just to make a point, right? And to score political support. So the two instances of him, marching out of the White House with full kind of paramilitary support, firing tear gas at people, and then sending unidentified federal agents to fire tear gas and arrest people in Portland, for instance, is just adding fuel to the fire, where instead, as a president, what you would want is to promote peace and try to de-escalate the situation. But by him doing it, it feeds into his law and order narrative. He thinks it makes him more attractive to suburban voters, but I don't think it works that way, that easily. I actually think his COVID response is a huge drag on him and his political fortunes and the ceiling he can get in terms of his support.
What do you think Trump did that is quite commendable? And how do
Yeah.
you empathize with his voters at this point?
The interesting thing about Trump is that Trump will do anything that makes him more popular in the eyes of the people. He's a populist, right? And he will do anything that would improve his chances of staying in the White House. And so for anyone who's an opportunist, this is actually a great moment to get things from him, right? And so there are a few moments when he wanted to show affinity for Black voters. He passed more funding for historically Black colleges and universities.
Right.
He did prison sentencing reform, right?
He did
Which
do
are
that, yeah.
He did
Criminal
do those
justice
things,
reform.
and criminal justice reform, and those are things that got passed bipartisan, and it did meet a lot of the goals that people who are Democratic and progressive have wanted. I think his tax reform overall was an utter disaster and a giveaway for corporations and wealthy people in terms of how the tax rates fell and the corporate tax cut. But there's pieces of the tax reform that I really liked. For instance, when he put a limit on the state and local tax deduction, that deduction was taken by mostly wealthy people who can itemize their deductions, right? And so by doing that, he actually made it slightly more progressive, even though his decrease in tax rates for the wealthy became less progressive. And so there was a progressive element in it. And also economic opportunity zones that he set up to bring investment to a lot of ignored and disadvantaged communities has in a way helped develop a lot of these communities and probably contributed in some of these communities having income growth in the lowest rungs of the income distribution, the people who are near poverty or near poverty. And so there are a few things that he did right. I can't say it's all him because Congress put the package together, but he signed it, right? Which is the COVID relief package with paycheck protection. Now, what ideally you would have done in this situation is not only have economic stimulus, but have very, very stringent, clear public health policy to actually eliminate or reduce the virus to a manageable level. And that's where Trump's flaw is that he doesn't do anything based on what makes policy sense or what creates, in a policy world, more economic benefit, right? He makes decisions based on what makes him more electable or more popular. And so even within his administration, it's chaotic because when you have to have a public health response with an economic response, you do the economic response, but you fail on the public health front, then the economic response was completely wasted. Because now we still have a public health crisis and we don't have any more stimulus money left. I think that is the greatest failure of the Trump presidency, is the chaos within it, the lack of policy direction, the lack of coordination, the lack of selling the policies to Congress and the American people. And I was hoping that we would be able to survive 4 years of the Trump administration relatively unscathed. It was looking that way until February, and then I have never seen the economy and the public health situation as bad as it is now. This is probably the worst outcome that we could have imagined of the Trump administration, short of going into a world war with China.
Right. I mean, I think it's quite symbolic that he refuses to wear a mask. He gets the disease, and then he sort of gets bailed out with all this additional medical attention he gets as an elite.
Mhm.
And he continues to peddle this notion that masks aren't really effective. So where do you think Biden stands on something like Prop 16, by the way? So Prop 16, for those that don't know, is a California constitutional amendment that will essentially bring in racial preference into public employment and public education. So that means as an Asian person applying to UC Berkeley, for example, your chances will now, after Prop 16 has been passed, will now be reduced because there will be racial preference for kids from a cohort that traditionally do not have as high an academic standing, do not get as good grades. So like the Blacks or Latinos, for example. Where do you think Biden stands on something like this? And where would you stand on something like this?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very great question. When affirmative action was done away with in a lot of public settings in the 2000s, schools became predominantly white and Asian, and minority enrollment plummeted, right, in most public institutions across the country, especially in California and places like California and Texas, for instance. And I feel like we are starting to see a reckoning of that now in society, of the negative aspects of having something like that happen. I want to take one example, which is, you work in the tech sector, I work in the tech sector. Diversity and inclusion is like a buzzword in the tech sector, right? Every single company is trying to increase the number of women and minorities, Latino and Black employees in their company. And they're not doing it just for show, right? Or they're not doing it just because, quote unquote, in their market, it's the right thing to do.
Virtue signaling.
They're doing it for business reasons. And the reason they're doing it is because they're starting to realize that they have no idea how to do business and strategy for these consumer markets, in which a country that is getting more diverse, becoming more Black and Latino, and all you have is a bunch of white and Asians trying to figure out how to build a business in these communities. And so from a talent perspective, and also from an economic perspective, there's a huge piece of our country that is basically economically disadvantaged and continuously ignored, both in the education sector and also in business. And because of that, we're not achieving our full potential as a country. There is a significant portion of people who are either unemployed or underemployed. They're very much there because of both institutional racism and also because of lack of opportunity. And fundamentally, that's a drag on our social safety net. We're paying taxes to support them because we haven't gotten our education system and our framework of racial equality to the point where folks who are disadvantaged, oftentimes, I'll just be frank, right? There's a racial element to poverty in the United States, don't have the resources that everyone else does. And so when you think about it from that perspective, I personally would be supportive of quotas or some kind of affirmative action in schools. That's one aspect of it. And then the second aspect of it is I once wrote a story about this. I looked at college admissions for Asian Americans. This is when I was in my journalism days. And the reality is the only colleges that Asians are really competitive in and would suffer if affirmative action was brought back are schools that their parents want them to apply to. And so this is like UC Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard, Cornell, all these top name schools that Asian parents want their kids to go to. However, if you look at maybe smaller colleges, top name liberal arts colleges, and so forth, these colleges are dying to get more Asians to go to them
But which
because,
ones are you talking about? Like Williams College?
yeah, like Williams, Whitman, right? Whitman College in Washington State, some of these small ones, right, that have really
Like
high
Amherst?
quality. Yeah, Amherst have high quality education, but predominantly white student bodies, and would still be a great source of education. But because the parents don't know about them, they don't want their kids going into them, right? And so, in fact, the story I wrote about was an Asian who got into Whitman and got all these scholarships for going to Whitman. She was Indian, and there weren't that many Indians there, and she got a great education out of it. And so honestly, I don't see the problem of making, say, UC Berkeley more diverse, because there are plenty of other great schools out there that would love to take in more Asian applicants. You just have to find where they are and who they are. I think the market is skewed in a way that Asians feel like they're going to be disadvantaged, but there's just so many schools out there that at the end of the day, it's going to even out.
So I'm personally against Prop 16. And I think there's a few different things I like to point out. So number one is presumably, even if Asians could go to schools like a Whitman or a Williams, why can't we make the argument that a non-Asian person could also just go there, for example, right? And then the other thing about what you were saying regarding how a big part of the American populace are not participating in the economy, and therefore that is a drag on the social net because we're paying taxes and so forth. I agree with that. But is the solution of increasing their representation at the college level, and especially certain elite universities, the right answer? Because I feel that to level the playing field for these minority groups, it's better to start earlier. I think it's a little too late when kids at their high school levels are lagging in competition and then you just give them quotas. I think it's better to actually provide that better opportunity to single parent families, to families that don't traditionally value education as much, or maybe homes that are so broken and so impoverished that they simply don't have the means to get extra tutors or have people to supervise the kids to be doing the right things, and basically provide resources at an earlier period. It's almost like, imagine people are running a marathon, right? You kind of want to make sure that people have the right setup at the beginning of the race, not at the end. You see, I feel like Prop 16 is sort of saying, okay, you came in third, but because of your skin color, we're going to make you first. Whereas it's better to say, okay, at the beginning, make sure everyone has the right shoes on, their shoes are all tied, they're all starting at the same line, everyone has received sufficient training and gotten enough food to eat or something like that. So I think I'm in general in favor of this idea of providing everyone a fair shot. It's just a matter of when that fair shot should be provided.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I will draw on my experience in Teach for America. I taught high school in the middle of the Mississippi Delta, which is a very rural, predominantly Black area. And what I can tell you is there's no way you can provide a fair shot to these kids that early. And the reason is because the area has no jobs, right? It used to be an agricultural place, predominantly cotton picking, based on way back in the day in kind of like the plantation rural cotton picking culture. And then when it became mechanized, all the agricultural jobs went away. And then because the region is in the middle of Mississippi with not very good infrastructure, not very good education, like companies don't want to locate there. And so what you end up having is just a endless revolving cycle of poverty where everyone who is talented have gone, even including teachers. So here's my question. How the heck do you provide a fair shot if a school doesn't even have a 40% stable teaching population to provide the kids with a fair shot, and have to bring folks like me who are fresh college grads who have a idealism at heart to travel to these places and to teach them. And so what you really need is to identify the kids. And I had some brilliant kids in my class. I had this one girl that I remembered who I was teaching her how, I was a math teacher, I was teaching her how to do a geometric proof. And then the minute I walked by to check on her work, I told her she did it wrong. And then she looked at me and said, "No, Mr. Yang, I did it right." And when I looked at it, I realized she solved the proof in a completely different way than I taught. And she figured it out herself. And so in situations like this, what you want is to be able to identify the kids who have somehow survived in that community and give them that spot at Harvard.
Yeah,
Because,
no, I see what you're saying.
do you see what I'm saying? Because those are the kids, like even if they don't have a 1600 SAT score, the fact that they got a 1200 in that environment means there's a hidden genius in there that can get to 1600 in the right environment. I could never give them that right environment where they grew up. By identifying the kids and sending them to elite universities, what you would hope is that they do go to the elite universities, they become successful, and then they do something about their community to change it and come back. So this one girl who solved the mathematical proof ended up coming back, became a science teacher in the community that I taught in, and then went to medical school, and then became a doctor in the community that I taught in. And so if she didn't have an opportunity, and she actually didn't end up going to elite school, she ended up going to, I believe, the University of Arkansas, which is the top school in the state that I taught in. But I mean, I wanted her to apply to Harvard, but she looked at me and said, "Doesn't Harvard not like Black people? I don't want to go to Harvard. There aren't any Black people at Harvard," right? You know, she had this preconceived notion that Harvard wasn't welcoming. But those are the kids that I would want to give them a shot at college and be able to do something for their community afterwards if they have the heart for it. And that's why I absolutely believe that we should be opening more seats to kids who have fought through everything that's impossible to get to the level where they can succeed at the elite level, right? And we have to provide them that opportunity to do that and then help develop their communities afterwards.
Right. Then I think then the debate becomes, number one, how do we direct public resources to fund more programs like TFA to stabilize that kind of teacher population in these places? And I suppose the counter argument there could be it's so much more expensive.
It's impossible because it's one of those self-fulfilling cycles. I mean, I was there for 2 years. I wasn't there to stay in the community and give back and to raise my kids in that environment. So even if you fund more TFA, all you just get is an army of people who are there for 2 years. You don't get anyone who stays.
Okay. But then I guess the other thing to mention is also just that the rubric can be more effort-based, but not just exclusively straight up race quota. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, so, and it's never like that. That is a misconception, right? Because at the end of the day, what race does is just adds points to your application, but they'll still need to look at your SAT score because, come on, Harvard isn't going to accept someone with a 900 SAT score. That person would never survive in Harvard academically. It would be a complete burnout, right? So,
right. But what I'm referring to, though, is also that it needs to be race/class based. You can't just accept a Black person from an elite circle who's lagging behind in SAT, right? It's much better to get that child that you mentioned, that you mentored in Mississippi versus somebody that went to some private school and had, you know, CEO dads and still got only 1,200 on the SATs.
Yeah, and that's also a somewhat of a novel. What's unique about the US is that race and class are integrally intertwined.
I'm saying it's highly correlated.
Very, very highly correlated, right? And so what you end up having is you end up solving the class problem if you focus on the communities that are disadvantaged based on race.
Yeah, I can completely understand.
Yep.
Well, Lin, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been a very informative session.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to hearing.
Well, thanks for dropping by and keep in touch.
Take care. Bye.
Okay. Bye, Lin.
Yeah.